The merciless July sun beat down on Henry Weatherford's weathered shoulders as he eased his ancient pickup into the crowded lot of the county livestock auction. Dust swirled in golden eddies around his boots. When he stepped out, the familiar scent of hay, manure, and desperation filling his nostrils. At 68, every joint in his body protested the movement. A symphony of aches playing the familiar melody of a lifetime spent coaxing stubborn earth into yielding crops. Henry hadn't planned on coming today. The envelope of carefully counted bills in his pocket was meant for seed, not sentiment. 6 months since Martha's passing, and the Weatherford farm teetered on the precipice between survival and memory. Yet something, perhaps Martha's voice whispering in the corners of his mind, had pulled him here despite every practical objection. The auction barn hummed with the low murmur of farmers and dealers, their voices mixing with the auctioneer's practiced cadence. Henry found a spot against the back wall, arms crossed over his faded flannel shirt, eyes scanning without interest as goats and cattle moved through with mechanical efficiency. He wasn't here to buy, just to remember how it felt to be among the living after months of quiet solitude. Then they brought in the black stallion. The crowd shifted uncomfortably, conversations dying mid-sentence. As the animal limped into the ring, Henry straightened, something tightening in his chest. The horse stood with its head bowed, ribs pressing against a dull coat that might once have gleamed like midnight waters. Scars crisscrossed its flanks, telling stories no creature should have to bear. But it was the eyes that froze Henry's breath in his lungs. When the stallion finally lifted its gaze, those eyes caught the harsh overhead lights, deep brown irises splintered with flecks of gold that seemed to capture and hold the sunlight itself. They weren't the vacant eyes of a broken animal, but windows into something profound and knowing. The auctioneer's voice faltered slightly, an almost imperceptible hesitation before he called for opening bids. The silence stretched uncomfortably long. Farm folk were practical people, and there was nothing practical about a half-starved, battle-scarred stallion. Henry's hand moved before his mind could object. A small, decisive gesture that seemed to surprise even himself. $25, a pittance. The auctioneer's eyebrows lifted, relief washing over his features as he called once, twice. No competing bids came. The crowd had already mentally moved on to the next lot. Something useful, something sensible. The gavel fell with a sharp crack that echoed through Henry's bones. The stallion's head lifted fully then, those impossible golden-flecked eyes finding Henry's across the crowded space. A connection sparked between them, inexplicable yet undeniable, like a key turning in a lock, long forgotten. Henry Weatherford, who had come with no intention to buy anything at all, now owned a broken horse that nobody wanted. The trailer rattled up the long graveled drive to the Weatherford farm, kicking up clouds of dust that hung suspended in the golden afternoon light. Claire stood on the porch, arms crossed tight against her chest, her honey-brown hair so like Martha's pulled back in a severe knot at the nape of her neck. 3 months since she'd returned home with 2 suitcases and the shattered remains of a 5-year marriage, her eyes still carried the cautious wariness of someone expecting disappointment around every corner. Henry felt her gaze boring into him as he carefully backed the trailer toward the old barn. The questions hung unspoken in the air between them, heavier than the oppressive summer heat. Money they didn't have, spent on a horse they didn't need. Henry couldn't explain the impulse even to himself, let alone to Claire, who counted pennies with the precision of someone who knew exactly how thin the line between survival and ruin could be. The stallion, midnight as Henry had already begun thinking of him, refused to exit the trailer, standing eerily motionless, those golden-flecked eyes fixed on something distant only he could see. It took Henry nearly an hour of gentle coaxing to lead him into the weathered barn, where empty stalls stood as silent reminders of better days, when the Weatherford farm had been a place of plenty rather than barely enough. Night descended over the farm, stars emerging like scattered salt across the indigo sky. Claire retreated into the house without a word. The screen doors creak, punctuating her disapproval. Henry remained in the barn, watching as midnight ignored the fresh hay and cool water, standing unnaturally still in the center of his stall, eyes never leaving Henry's face. The connection between them hummed like a plucked guitar string, resonant and inexplicable. Dr. Sarah Reeves arrived the next morning, her ancient Jeep leaving fresh ruts in the rain-softened drive. 35 years, as the county's only large animal vet, had etched permanent lines around her eyes and mouth, yet her hands remained steady as she approached midnight. With professional caution, the stallion tensed at her touch, but allowed the examination, nostrils flaring, muscles quivering beneath his dull coat. Sarah's expression changed as she moved methodically over the horse's body, her practiced fingers finding what Henry's eyes had missed. Beneath the visible scars lay precise patterns, small circular marks along the spine, symmetrical lines behind the ears, a strangely uniform grid of healed punctures along the stallion's muscular neck. Not the random injuries of neglect or abuse, but something deliberate, something methodical. Henry felt a chill race down his spine as Sarah carefully traced one particular scar at the base of Midnight's skull, barely visible beneath the coarse black mane. Her voice, when she finally spoke, carried the careful neutrality of someone choosing their words with extreme precision. No ordinary racing stable or breeding farm had done this. These wounds told a different story, one of clinical precision, of purpose, of experimentation that had never been meant for kind eyes to discover. Sleep no longer came easily to Henry Weatherford. Each night, as the ancient farmhouse creaked and settled around him, his dreams twisted into something wild and unfamiliar. He found himself racing across landscapes he had never seen, jagged mountains silhouetted against star-filled skies, dense forests where moonlight filtered through leaves like silver rain, vast meadows stretching endlessly before him, the sensation of powerful muscles bunching and releasing beneath him, the rhythmic thunder of hooves striking earth, the wind streaming through his. Henry would jolt awake, heart hammering against his ribs, sheets twisted and damp with sweat. The dreams left him disoriented, as if his soul had been temporarily housed in another body, seeing through eyes not his own. He blamed the strange visions on age, on grief, on the worry that gnawed constantly at the edges of his mind. Anything but their true source. 3 weeks after bringing Midnight home, Henry found himself wide awake at 3 in the morning, that liminal hour when the barrier between worlds seems thinnest. Moonlight spilled through his bedroom window, painting silver patterns across the worn floorboards. Something pulled at him, an invisible thread tugging gently but insistently. Henry slipped from bed, bones protesting as he shuffled to the window that overlooked the back pasture. The full moon hung heavy in the velvet sky, casting the farm in an otherworldly glow. At first, Henry saw nothing unusual. Then his eyes fixed on a shadow, standing perfectly still in the center of the moonlit field. Midnight, head raised, ears pricked forward in intense concentration. The stallion hadn't moved a muscle, his attention fixed on the tree line, at the property's edge, where the forest began its slow climb up the mountainside. Henry felt it then, a strange pressure building behind his eyes, a humming tension that seemed to vibrate through his very bones. Without conscious decision, he found himself walking outside, bare feet silent, against the dew-dampened grass. The night air wrapped around him, cool and expectant, as he approached the motionless horse. Midnight didn't acknowledge Henry's presence, still staring fixedly at something invisible among the distant trees. Standing beside the stallion now, Henry followed his gaze, squinting into the darkness. Nothing, just shadows and silence. He placed a weathered hand on Midnight's warm neck, feeling the steady pulse beneath the coarse hair. The whisper came then, not through his ears, but directly into his mind, clear as crystal, yet soft as falling snow. "They'll be looking for me." Henry stumbled backward, heart seizing in his chest. The words hadn't been spoken aloud yet, rang through his consciousness with unmistakable clarity. Midnight finally turned, fixing those golden-flecked eyes on Henry's face. Something ancient and knowing gazed out from behind that animal stare. Something impossible. Dawn found Henry at the kitchen table, hands wrapped around a cooling cup of coffee, convincing himself it had been nothing but exhaustion and imagination. The mind played tricks when deprived of rest. The coffee's bitter warmth could not, however, dissolve the lingering certainty that settled in his bones. Something extraordinary had awakened on the Weatherford farm, something that defied the comfortable boundaries of Henry's world. The storm rolled in from the west, a bruised wall of clouds that swallowed the afternoon sun. In one hungry gulp, Henry worked quickly in the barn, the rhythmic scrape of his pitchfork against the wooden floor keeping time with the distant thunder. Rain began to drum against the old metal roof, 1,000 impatient fingers tapping out an urgent rhythm as the wind rose to a mournful howl. Midnight watched from his stall, those golden-flecked eyes tracking Henry's every movement with unnerving intensity. The ancient barn had weathered a century of storms, but this one seemed determined to test its resolve. Water found new paths through the aging roof, forming puddles on the uneven floor. Henry moved to spread sawdust over a particularly slick patch when lightning split the sky outside, illuminating the barn in a harsh white flash. Thunder followed instantly, a physical force that seemed to shake the very foundations beneath his feet. It happened in the space between heartbeats. Henry's boot sliding on the slick surface, his body twisting unnaturally as his balance failed him. The sickening crack of bone meeting concrete came almost as an afterthought to the white-hot lance of pain that shot through his right leg. He lay crumpled on the wet floor, the pitchfork clattering away into the shadows, rain dripping steadily onto his upturned face through a gap in the roof. Minutes stretched into an eternity as Henry tried to move, each attempt sending fresh waves of agony through his body. His cell phone sat uselessly in the kitchen, and Claire had gone into town for supplies. The pain intensified as the initial shock wore off, his broken leg throbbing in time with his racing heart. Darkness gathered at the edges of his vision, threatening to pull him under. A sharp splintering sound cut through the storm's fury. Through pain-blurred eyes, Henry watched as Midnight's stall door burst open, the solid wood latch snapping like a twig under the force of the stallion's powerful shoulder. The black horse approached cautiously, hooves picking a careful path across the wet floor. Henry lay motionless, pain and fear rendering him incapable of retreat. Midnight lowered his massive head until his muzzle almost touched Henry's face. The horse's breath came warm against his chilled skin, smelling of sweet hay and something more primal. Their eyes locked, weathered blue meeting deep brown splintered with gold, and the world around them seemed to fall away. The barn disappeared. The pain receded. Henry found himself adrift in a flood of images not his own. Sterile white rooms with blinding lights, the sharp bite of needles, men in lab coats with cold eyes and surgical masks. Fear, confusion, rage surged through him with overwhelming force. Metal tables and restraints, the hum of machinery, the sensation of something foreign being inserted at the base of his skull. Voices discussing results, progress, enhanced capabilities. Subject 17 showing promising neural adaptation. Henry gasped as reality crashed back around him, the barn materializing once more through tear-blurred eyes. The connection had lasted mere seconds, yet he understood with bone-deep certainty that he had just experienced Midnight's memories, not dreams or hallucinations, but the terrible truth of what had been done to this creature before chance and pity had brought them together. Midnight's eyes held his, no longer a horse's gaze, but a window into a soul as complex and wounded as any human's. In that moment, as rain continued to fall and thunder rolled across the heavens, something profound and irrevocable shifted between them. Henry's recovery tethered him to the farmhouse, his broken leg a constant reminder of how quickly life could change. Claire had fashioned a makeshift bed in the living room, surrounded by the faded wallpaper. Martha had chosen decades ago. She brought him meals, changed his bandages, and watched him with eyes that held questions she didn't dare voice. Questions about how he'd managed to drag himself from the barn during that violent storm, about the strange intensity with which he stared toward the pasture where Midnight grazed. The dreams intensified during those long, pain-filled nights. Not dreams at all, Henry understood now, but memories, Midnight's memories flowing between them like water seeking its level. Each morning, Claire would find her father's face drawn and haggard, marked by knowledge no human was meant to bear. When he could finally navigate the porch steps with his crutches, Henry began spending long hours seated on an old wooden chair by the fence line. Midnight would approach cautiously, black coat gleaming in the autumn sunlight, those golden-flecked eyes holding Henry's gaze without blinking. The connection between them deepened with each passing day, images and sensations flowing more freely as they learned to navigate the strange bridge between their minds. Through these silent communions, the truth emerged in fragments and flashes. A hidden facility deep in the mountains of West Virginia, a program concealed behind layers of military classification. Project Echo, a name chosen for its double meaning. Echo for sound, returning, for communication coming back, for the ghostly reflection of consciousness itself. Midnight had not always been Midnight. Once, he had been Subject 17, one of 23 animals selected for their intelligence and neural plasticity. The scientists had started with simple goals, creating animals that could understand basic commands telepathically, reducing the need for vocal cues in combat situations. The neural implants at the base of the skull, the carefully calibrated injections, the endless tests and training sessions, all designed to create the perfect four-legged soldier. But something unexpected had happened with Subject 17. The connection had developed beyond their protocols, beyond their understanding. The stallion hadn't just received thoughts. He had begun to project his own. He had tasted the minds of his handlers, had learned to slip between the cracks of their consciousness like shadow through an open door. The day they decided to terminate the experiment was the day 17 escaped, using his newfound abilities to create confusion, to redirect attention, to become nothing more than a blind spot in the minds of those who sought to destroy him. For weeks he had run, staying ahead of their searches, his enhanced mind allowing him to sense pursuit before it arrived, until exhaustion and hunger had delivered him to that forgotten auction pen where Henry's compassion had changed everything. Henry absorbed these revelations like body blows, each one leaving him more stunned than the last. The government men would still be searching. They would never stop looking for their escaped asset, for the scientific miracle that had evolved beyond their control. The stallion carried too many secrets, too much classified knowledge in that enhanced mind. During those quiet afternoons, with autumn leaves drifting around them like fragments of a forgotten season, Henry came to understand the weight of the responsibility that had been placed on his aging shoulders. Not just a horse, but a refugee. Not just a connection, but a covenant. Midnight had chosen him, had recognized in Henry's weather-worn spirit something worthy of trust. As their minds touched across the ancient divide between human and animal, Henry made a silent promise that would reshape every day to come. He would protect this extraordinary creature, whatever the cost. The first sign of trouble came with the changing leaves, as October painted the countryside in flames of crimson and gold. A black SUV with government plates, moving too slowly along the county road that bordered the eastern edge of the Weatherford property. Henry might have dismissed it as coincidence, had he not felt Midnight's sudden tension humming through their connection like an electric current. Claire noticed things too, in her quiet, watchful way. She mentioned nothing of the dark sedan parked at Miller's Crossing 3 days in a row, or the men with binoculars she glimpsed while hanging laundry on the line. But Henry saw the way her shoulders tightened when the phone rang, how she began checking the locks twice before bed. On Thursday, she finally broke her silence over dinner, fork suspended above her untouched potatoes as she described the call that had come to the general store where she worked part-time. A polite voice asking about local farmers who might have purchased horses at auction in the past few months. Specific questions about unusual markings, about behavior, about a black stallion with distinctive eyes. The cast had come off Henry's leg the previous week, leaving him with a persistent limp and a deep-seated ache that worsened with the evening chill. Still, he drove into town the following morning, the truck's heater fighting a losing battle against the autumn frost. Sheriff Tom Miller had been Henry's friend since childhood, their lives running parallel through school, through Vietnam, through marriages and losses that had carved similar lines into their weathered faces. Tom's office smelled of coffee and gun oil, the worn leather chair creaking beneath Henry's weight as the sheriff closed the door with unusual care. The warning came wrapped in the casual language of old friends, but the concern in Tom's eyes betrayed the gravity beneath his measured words. Men from some unnamed agency had been asking questions throughout the county. They carried credentials that made the state police captain nervous. They were looking for a missing research animal, potentially dangerous, possibly stolen. They'd been showing photographs at local businesses. They'd been running license plates. Henry returned home as the sun began its descent, the western sky burning with an intensity that seemed to mirror the unease spreading through his chest. Claire was already inside, windows locked despite the mild evening, curtains drawn against watching eyes. Midnight waited in the far pasture, silhouetted against the dying light, head raised as if scenting something on the wind. That night, as clouds gathered to veil the stars, Henry sat by his bedroom window, staring out at the darkened landscape. The connection opened without warning, Midnight's consciousness flowing into his with an urgency that stole his breath. Images crashed through his mind in chaotic succession. Men loading equipment into unmarked vans, satellite photos of the Weatherford farm circled in red, a sterile room with restraints waiting for Subject 17's return. The final vision came with devastating clarity. The farmhouse engulfed in flames, a necessary casualty, collateral damage to be erased with falsified reports and sealed records. Henry pressed his forehead against the cool glass, heart pounding in his throat. They weren't just coming for Midnight. They were coming to reclaim their property, to eliminate witnesses, to bury the truth beneath whatever cover story would be most convenient. And they were close now. So close that Midnight could sense their thoughts like approaching thunder. Dawn painted the horizon in watercolor shades of rose and amber. As Henry sat at the kitchen table, the weight of his impossible choice pressing against his chest like a stone. The coffee in his mug had long gone cold, forgotten in the tangle of his thoughts. Surrender Midnight to the people who had created him, who would dissect his remarkable mind and destroy what made him special, or run, becoming fugitives from a government that could crush them without leaving so much as a fingerprint on the pieces. Every rational thought argued for self-preservation. Henry was an old man with a recently healed leg, not a hero from one of those action movies Claire sometimes watched. The farm had been his family's for 3 generations. This land held Martha's memory in every creaking floorboard, in every blooming rosebush she had planted with her own hands. To abandon it would be to lose her a second time. Yet the alternative, betraying Midnight, felt like surrendering his own soul. The screen door's hinges protested as Claire stepped inside, her face drawn with exhaustion from a night spent watching the road for unfamiliar vehicles. She moved to speak but froze, eyes widening as she looked past Henry toward the window. Henry turned to find Midnight standing just outside the glass, those golden-flecked eyes fixed on him with desperate intensity. The connection opened between them like a floodgate, thoughts and images cascading through Henry's mind with such force that he gasped, knuckles whitening around the edge of the table. He didn't notice Claire's approach until her hand touched his shoulder, her voice seeming to come from a great distance as she called his name with increasing urgency. When Henry finally surfaced from the torrent of shared consciousness, he found Claire kneeling beside him, her face a mask of concern. The explanation spilled from him then. Everything about Project Echo, about the telepathic link, about the danger closing in around them, words tumbling over each other in his haste to make her understand before she concluded her father had finally lost his grip on reality. What Henry never expected was the soft wonder that dawned across Claire's features as she turned toward the window where Midnight still stood watching. She moved as if in a trance, palm pressing against the cool glass. Midnight shifted, bringing his muzzle to the exact spot where her hand rested on the other side. The change in Claire was subtle, but unmistakable. A slight stiffening of her spine, a soft gasp, pupils dilating as something passed between them. Midnight had chosen to share his gift, to forge a new bridge between minds. In that moment, as understanding bloomed across his daughter's face, Henry felt the weight on his shoulders lighten fractionally. He was no longer alone in this impossible situation. Night gathered around the farmhouse as the three unlikely conspirators bent their minds toward survival. Midnight's knowledge of his former handler's protocols, Claire's practical ingenuity, Henry's lifetime of working the land, each bringing unique strengths to the desperate plan taking shape between them. They would need to leave by dawn, abandoning nearly everything, trusting in bonds stronger than blood or species, to carry them through what lay ahead. As midnight approached and the final details fell into place, Henry realized with quiet certainty that he had already made his choice long ago. Perhaps in that first moment, when golden-flecked eyes had met his, across a dusty auction ring. Some connections once formed could never be severed, not by distance, not by danger, not even by death itself. The eastern sky had just begun to bleed from black to deep indigo when Henry felt Midnight's urgent warning pulse through their connection. 7 vehicles approaching from the south road, minds focused with predatory intensity. The raid had begun ahead of schedule. Henry touched Claire's shoulder, no words needed, as she instantly abandoned the last bag she'd been packing and moved to her position by the kitchen door. Their plan hinged on perfect timing and the element of surprise, the one advantage their pursuers couldn't anticipate. Decades of working this land had etched every hollow creek and ridgeline into Henry's memory. The northern woods, with their dense undergrowth and hidden game trails, offered their only viable escape route. But first, they needed time and distraction. Midnight stood in the shadows of the barn, his consciousness stretched outward like invisible tendrils, monitoring the approaching agent's thoughts. Through their shared connection, Henry felt the stallion's concentration, a sensation like cold water flowing through his veins. The timer on the old propane tank behind the tool shed would trigger in precisely 47 seconds. Not an explosion large enough to harm anyone, but sufficient to draw attention to the south pasture while they slipped away to the north. The first silver-gray government SUV crested the hill just as Henry and Claire reached the tree line. Midnight followed silently behind them, his hooves finding impossible purchase on the rocky ground without making a sound. The distant thump of the propane tank igniting sent birds scattering from the trees in panicked clouds. Shouts erupted behind them as the agents redirected toward the billowing smoke, exactly as planned. They pushed deeper into the forest, the pale light of dawn barely penetrating the thick canopy above. Claire led the way, moving with the sure-footed determination that had always been her hallmark. Even as a child, Henry followed, his recently healed leg protesting with each uncertain step on the uneven ground. Midnight moved between them, a shadow among shadows. It happened as they crossed the narrow creek that marked the boundary of the Weatherford property. A sudden awareness bloomed in Henry's mind, not the familiar presence of Midnight's consciousness, but something new, something impossible. He could feel Claire's focused determination ahead of him, the mixture of fear and hope coursing through her like electricity. Beyond that, fainter but unmistakable, came the hunter's frustration from the agents now realizing they'd been deceived. Henry stumbled, momentarily overwhelmed by the cascade of impressions. His vision sharpened, colors intensifying as if someone had adjusted the contrast of the world. The forest floor beneath his boots, suddenly carried a map of scents, deer, that had passed hours ago, the musk of fox territory, the mineral tang of the creek water. His hearing extended beyond natural limits, catching the faint drone of radios at the farmhouse nearly a mile behind them. Midnight pressed his muzzle against Henry's shoulder, those golden-flecked eyes reflecting understanding. The connection had evolved, transformed them both. The neural bridge the scientist had forcibly created in Midnight was something the stallion could now forge naturally, and the bond between them had begun changing Henry in ways no one could have predicted. As they crested the ridge that would shield them from tracking equipment, the rising sun finally broke through the trees, bathing them in amber light. Behind them lay everything Henry had ever known. Ahead stretched a future as uncharted as the wilderness itself. Yet in the quiet space between heartbeats, as three unlikely fugitives paused on the threshold of a new life, Henry felt something unexpected unfurl within his chest. Not regret, not fear, but a wild, fierce hope. Snow blanketed the rolling hills surrounding the old timber farmhouse, transforming the Canadian wilderness into a landscape of pristine white broken only by the dark silhouettes of pine and spruce. Smoke curled lazily from the stone chimney, carrying the scent of wood fire into the crisp morning air. 6 months had passed since Henry Weatherford had walked away from everything he knew, following a black stallion with golden-flecked eyes into an uncertain future. The sanctuary had begun with Midnight, but it hadn't ended there. The stone barn, rebuilt and expanded with the help of like-minded allies, now housed 7 other animals, each bearing the telltale surgical scars of Project Echo and its sister programs. A red mare whose telepathic abilities manifested primarily through emotional transfer, a wolf-dog hybrid who could project visual memories with startling clarity, a raven whose enhanced intelligence allowed it to solve complex puzzles that would challenge most humans. Claire had transformed the farmhouse's sunroom into an operations center, walls covered with maps marking the locations of other research facilities, communication lines to underground networks of sympathetic veterinarians and former military personnel turned whistleblowers. Her fingers flew across laptop keys with practiced precision, coordinating rescue operations with the same quiet determination she had once applied to keeping the old Weatherford farm afloat. Henry's connection with Midnight had deepened beyond anything the government scientists could have anticipated. What began as brief flashes of shared consciousness had evolved into something profound and symbiotic. Each morning, standing in the snowy field with his forehead pressed against Midnight's warm neck, Henry surrendered to the joining of their minds, a communion that left him more whole, not less. With each passing day, the breakthrough had come last month when Dr. Eleanor Chen, a neurologist who had once worked peripherally on Project Echo before ethics compelled her to leave, confirmed what Henry had suspected. The changes in his neural patterns weren't damage or deterioration, but evolution, new pathways forming, dormant capabilities awakening. What the government had artificially forced upon Midnight through surgery and chemical manipulation, nature was now accomplishing through the simple sustained connection between two beings who had chosen each other. Through Midnight's unique abilities, they had located and rescued others like him. The discarded failures and escaped subjects from government programs too, classified to officially exist. Each animal brought to the sanctuary carried pieces of a larger puzzle, fragments of research, glimpses of facilities, names of scientists and handlers. Together they formed a mosaic of truth too powerful to remain hidden forever. As the winter sun climbed higher, Henry stood at the edge of the field, watching Midnight lead the newest arrival. A young palomino with trembling legs and haunted eyes in slow circles around the paddock. The stallion's patience was infinite, his guidance offered without demand or expectation. In these quiet moments, Henry glimpsed the future taking shape before him. Not just a sanctuary for broken beings, but the beginning of a profound shift in understanding. What had begun as a simple act of pity at a forgotten auction had blossomed into something revolutionary. The recognition that the boundaries between species were far more permeable than humanity had ever dared to imagine. The capacity for connection, for understanding, beyond words. had always existed, not just in specially enhanced animals, but in all living things. It had simply been waiting for hearts open enough to listen, to feel, to believe. If you've been touched by Henry and Midnight's extraordinary journey, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more stories that will open your heart and expand your understanding of the world around us. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video, where more miracles await those willing to believe in the impossible.